All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 32, The End of the Cold War and the Challenge of Economic Development and Immigration, 1975 to the year 2000. We'll be looking at Section 1 here, Post-Colonial Crises and Asian Economic Expansion. So this was something that we talked about in an earlier chapter, proxy wars. But if you need a little refresher on what proxy wars is, a proxy war is a conflict with the United States and Soviet Union indirectly fighting one another. Right? Let's say fighting each other. Recall that, we had talked a lot about the Cold War. And as a conflict, the Cold War typically 1945 till about 1989. And even though the US and the Soviet Union didn't go to war directly with one another, they often fought indirectly with each other. And one great example that we used in the previous chapter was the case of Vietnam. And so these proxy wars are fought really throughout the rest of the world. And one area which was a major hotspot for proxy wars or indirect conflict between the Soviets and the Americans was in Latin America. In Latin America, it was a little bit different than the rest of the world. Recall the rest of the world was going through decolonization. Right? That is the process of becoming independent from the imperial powers. In Latin America, it was more of economic imperialism. That was, the countries in Latin America were politically independent. However, much of their economies were controlled by outside powers, the British, the French, the Americans, etc., etc. And kind of a major conflict that kind of characterizes a lot of the politics in Latin America was the conflict between the US and Cuba, right? Cuba led by Fidel Castro, support of the Soviet Union, a communist state, the United States effort to try to oust Castro, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a lot of kind of anti-imperialistic sentiment towards the United States was often kind of cloaked or draped in the rhetoric of the Cold War, communism versus capitalism. So really throughout the 1960s through about the 1980s, political violence really characterized Latin America. Just some examples we'll talk about here. In Brazil in 1964, the government was overthrown by a military coup. That's what that word means. Coup means a military takeover. In the country of Chile, Salvador Allende was feared by the United States. Feared by the US to be too close to a communist regime. The US president at the time, Richard Nixon, US president, pretty much authorized regime change there, fearing that Allende and Allende's regime would lead to the spread of communism. So US president authorized regime change. And in Allende's place, Augusto Pinochet, a military dictator, took control. Again, all of these being incredibly violent transitions of government. We'll say military dictator. Pro-United States, right? The US supported him for his anti-communist positions. In Argentina, the same thing, 1967 coup. Again, a coup is a military takeover that occurred. A dirty war occurred in which we'll just sort of characterize this as political violence, right? In Nicaragua, something similar to Chile, again, all these countries in Latin America, Sandinistas. Sandinistas were, again, maybe a communist, we'll call it a communist, or at least in the eyes of the United States, they were we'll just call it a revolutionary movement, too close to communism for the US. Again, sort of fearing the same thing, that perhaps communist takeover might occur in Nicaragua. The US president at the time, Richard Nixon, surprisingly, despite interventions in Chile, was actually somewhat restrained when it came to Cold War interventions. It was the President Richard Nixon that ended the Vietnam War, and it was Richard Nixon who established relations with China. Successive US President Jimmy Carter was much more of a humanitarian. Really during his time in office, there was a lot less of these types of interventions that you saw in Chile with Pinochet. He was more of a humanitarian. Wanted to demonstrate goodwill towards Latin America, less that was done in the past. One example of this was the Panama Canal Zone, which was initially controlled by the United States. Jimmy Carter essentially gave back the canal zone to Panama. So we might say the canal zone was given back to Panama by Carter. And again, the idea there was the United States would try and lead by example, which was a strategy for the Cold War in some cases. However, when Jimmy Carter lost the election to U.S. President Ronald Reagan in 1980, Ronald Reagan was much more aggressive and confrontational. Say confrontational with Cold War. And one of the things that the Reagan administration did was to illegally arm the Contras. The Contras are anti-communist fighters in Nicaragua. So essentially, the Contras and the Sandinistas were fighting one another in Nicaragua. Sandinistas, again, United States fearing that they're too close to communism. The Contras being funded by the Reagan administration. And the reason why I say illegally was because of the experience of Vietnam. The US Congress was actually very fearful that the United States might be entering another Vietnam-like scenario and wanted to limit American armed involvement. So Congress actually prohibited the Reagan administration from funding the Contra fighters. But the Reagan administration did that anyways against Congress's wishes. So we might say about here, funded by the U.S. And again, this would be a much more, this would be another example of how the United States played a role in armed conflict. So when we look, especially throughout the 1960s, really throughout the 1980s, again, Latin America is really characterized by political violence. Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Nicaragua, right? All these are examples of political violence, military overthrows, really unstable governments, and frequent government changing. This started to die down around the 2000s. So nearly every single country in Latin America restored some sort of civilian rule as opposed to military rules. We'll say, approximately by the 2000s. This opened up many of those countries to U.S. investments once again. However, there have been some vocal critics of U.S. investments. A lot of people in Latin America maybe suggest that this is a sort of form of neocolonialism, that Latin America is simply only returning to a past when the United States controlled, the economies in Latin America very deeply. One good example of a vocal critic of U.S. involvement in Latin America, especially in regards to U.S. investments, is Hugo Chavez. He is president of Venezuela. I think 1998 was when he was elected, although I may be wrong on that. But we'll call him a vocal critic of Latin America. Oh, sorry, no, vocal critic in Latin America of U.S., right, of the United States. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, again, we have the guys, or we have the we have the Cold War going on in the background, and, we can't forget that. But again, many of these proxy wars often have to do with things that are not directly related to the Cold War, but sometimes take on sort of a Cold War kind kind of cover to it. A good example is some of the changes going on in the Middle East in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. A lot of what's going on in the Middle East, at least on the ground, is kind of the clash between secular culture and religious culture. And of course, this gets kind of overshadowed by the Cold War and how the Cold War, in a lot of ways, influences this. It also has to do with imperialism in the Middle East. So one good example of this, or a good example of how all this kind of comes together, is in the case of Iran. Iran in the 1970s was ruled by the Reza Shah, or just the Shah as he's called, supported by the CIA, the American Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA essentially installed the pro-US Shah in the 1950s. And this was mostly done to protect economic interests in the area. By the 1970s, Iran had moved to nationalize a lot of its economy. However, there was still the kind of cultural division, you might say. And the Reza Shah really represented not just foreign rule, again, supported by the CIA, represented foreign and secular rule. And so a revolution against the rule of the Shah, right, who was supported by the United States, erupted in Iran in 1979. The Ayatollah Khomeini, so he's the leader of the Iranian Revolution. And what the revolution did was to overthrow, so the Shah was overthrown, the pro-US dictator, the pro-secular US dictator, and install or instead create a much more religious government. The Islamic Republic of Iran, anti-Western, anti-Israeli. Often, sometimes we can call this kind of a theocratic government. It is a government in which religion is very heavily tied to it. In Iran, this is Shiite Islam. So one example of some of the changes that were made were in dress, for example, requiring women to wear certain clothing as opposed to the Western style of clothing that you may have seen in Iran under the Shah. And one major crisis for the United States during this revolution was that a number of American hostages were taken in the capital city of Tehran. So American hostages taken in Tehran. I think I'm spelling that right. Tehran. And this was a major crisis in the United States. And really ever since this ever since this revolution, there's been very uneasy relationships between the United States and Iran. Eventually, the American hostages were freed, but it marked a major political crisis. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the leader of this Iranian revolution, you can see his burial here, lots of people turning out for that. Meanwhile, the revolution in Iran sparked off a war in the neighboring country of Iraq. Saddam Hussein, who was a secular dictator of Iraq, right? Ruler of Iraq, secular dictator, feared a Shiite, we might just call it uprising. Iraq is a country that has three major, religious or ethnic groups: Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, and a Kurdish population. And, Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni Muslim, feared that the Shiites, inspired by the events going on in Iran, might challenge his authority. The Iran-Iraq War, very bloody, 1980 to 1988. And it was, at least in this period, that the United States showed some support for Iraq and Saddam Hussein, which is, considering the events that happened afterwards with the U.S. regime change in Iraq, is kind of interesting to take note of. Another major center for this sort of clash, we might say, of secular and religious values took place in Afghanistan. And again, at the time between the 1980s, from the 1970s up until the ending of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were really kind of blind to a lot of the more local reasons for conflict. In the eyes of the United States, the Iranian Revolution was orchestrated by the Soviet Union, or at least very closely tied to that. It was only after the Cold War ended that there was sort of a better understanding of the causality of some of these events. So in Iran, it was partially religious, it was partially anti-imperialist, it was partially based off principles of self-determination and wanting to get rid of the US-supported Shah. In Afghanistan, it was believed to be a communist/capitalist intervention, but maybe a more appropriate way of viewing the Afghan conflict is, again, through this lens of secular versus religious. So Afghanistan was a country that really had kind of remained out of imperial control for a very long time. But in the 1970s, when a Marxist or communist party was poised to take control, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So we'll say invaded Afghanistan. And they were in a war of occupation, sometimes called the Soviet Union's Vietnam. So in the same way that the United States was fighting in Vietnam to stop communism, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to protect communism. And on the opposite side of that, right, in their war of occupation, were primarily Islamic fighters. These were supported by the US. All right, so we'll say supported by the US. But they weren't fighting for capitalism, they weren't fighting for democracy. They were fighting, again, a struggle that was more along these lines. The Communist Party is anti-religious from the perspective of the Islamic fighters in Afghanistan. They were fighting against, infidels. And because this was the Cold War, anyone fighting against the Soviet Union, really regardless of what their beliefs or values are, is ultimately supported by the United States. Ultimately, like the United States in Vietnam, the Soviet Union did have to retreat. It was a defeat for the Soviets. And in fact, one of the contributing factors to the downfall of the Soviet Union, a very costly war that went on for a very long time. I think it was all throughout the 1970s, no, 1980s. I don't know exactly the year that the Soviets retreated, maybe 88. But after their retreat, a few years of civil war led to the rise of the Taliban. The Taliban was we'll call it a fundamental Islamic regime. And during the war with the Soviet Union, Osama bin Laden, who we'll talk about a little bit later, he's a very wealthy person from Saudi Arabia, supported the fight against the Soviets, right? So interestingly enough, Osama bin Laden was supporting the same fighters that the United States was in the 1980s. Ultimately, Osama bin Laden and his organization, Al-Qaeda, Qaeda, is responsible for the September 11th attacks on the United States. So again, interesting to note that, two conflicts in the 21st century, the September 11th attacks and the invasion of Iraq, that during the 1980s and 1990s, during the Cold War, both enemies of the United States in Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were essentially on the same side of different conflicts here. In Asia, pretty significant transformation takes place between 1970 and 1990, and this is mostly an economic transformation. Japan becomes the second largest economy. We'll say 1980, only to be surpassed by China, which becomes the second largest behind the United States economy by the year 2000. right? So major shift in terms of global economic production back towards Asia, really, since the Industrial Revolution. In Japan, it was major alliances between banks and businesses, Keiretsu. So this is an alliance between banks and business. A lot of this is very closely tied to what we call economic nationalism. The Japanese really doing a lot to protect their economies. Tariffs, I think, maybe just one R. And that is to make sure that Japanese businesses are protected from foreign competition. And the idea there is that, that will help foster Japanese economies. Again, massive, massive, massive growth in the economies of what's called the Asian tiger. So these are fast growing Asian economies. It's just a nickname that they sometimes give to these economies. South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, all these become very technical, high-producing economies in Asia, sometimes referred to as newly industrialized economies. A lot of these things helped produce or were the center for what was called the technological revolution, things like cell phones, personal computers, automobiles. A lot of that has to do with the fast and rapid growth in these particular countries. Meanwhile, China goes through a pretty significant transformation, and that is, changing its economy in a way to be more integrated with the world. After Mao Zedong died in 1976, Deng Xiaoping became leader of China and reformed the economy, really to make it more capitalist. Some good examples include foreign investment. China, for the very first time since the communist takeover, opened up to foreign investors to bring in companies. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Starbucks, Nike, all came to China to let people sell their own goods, right? This was another change that occurred. That, under communism, especially farmers, for example, they didn't really own their crops. The government did. So this led to very, very, very rapid economic transformations. Again, putting China the second largest economy in the year 2000. And, I don't know what it is right now, but it wouldn't surprise me if China has surpassed the United States. If it hasn't surpassed the US yet, it's soon to surpass the US, right? At the same time, it puts China kind of in this weird position because on the one hand, in terms of the economy, China is becoming more capitalist. But on the other hand, in terms of its politics, right, it's still very much ruled by the Communist Party. And a good example of this is what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Pro-democracy protests were held. People in China now having the rights to make their own economic decisions want the ability to make their own political decisions. And so in Tiananmen Square in 1989, a bunch of people protested, a bunch of students protested, and the government came in and just massacred the people there. Pro-democracy, we might say about violently put down. Right. So again, China is in kind of this weird area where on the one hand, it is becoming every day more and more economically free, but in terms of politics, the right to vote, the right to freedom of speech, the right to visit whatever websites that you want, still very, very much controlled in that way.